an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Elder Empire Shadow Book 2, chapters 18, 19, and 20. In these chapters, Shera finally kills the Emperor. I'm pretty sure. And it doesn't go at all like I thought it was going to go. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to George for commissioning this entire series. George, if you're out there, thank you so much again. So I'm going to start off this episode talking a little bit of shit about Brandon Sanderson. And I don't want anybody to think that this means that I think he is a bad writer. But I have shared my thoughts about this on the Mistborn episodes as well. And a lot of people had wanted me to cover Stormlight Archive. And I decided to listen to the audiobooks that are available for Stormlight Archive so far to determine whether it would be something I would be interested in. And he uses a very similar story structure as is used in these books, where we have some present day and then we go back and we learn about trauma and then we come back to present day. And I was complaining a little bit. There's a thread that I created under the books channel on my Discord, just to talk about how I'm feeling about this series as I read it. And what I find so frustrating is that the trauma of what happens to everyone in the, like, all of the main characters that gets like revealed over the course of a couple of books is really, really predictable. When you hear their thoughts in the present about what happened, in some cases, I think it's supposed to be more of a surprise once you go back and you find out what really happened. But personally, I did not find them surprising. I kind of thought that was going to be the thing, and it wound up being the thing. And therefore, this long teased out, this mysterious thing that happened at some point in the past that they're still haunted by, it just felt very tedious because I knew what it was going to be, and when it happened, it was exactly what I thought. And so it just sort of felt like you could have just like told me instead of drawing this out this way, because that didn't really add anything in my opinion. And I don't know, that may be different for other readers. And sometimes I think that's a hazard of like what I do for a living and starting to like get wise to the tricks that get used narratively, that it can like cause me to be a little bit more just like alert for that kind of thing in a way that a reader who's just reading for pleasure might not be. So I was saying that this frustrated me, like only like, because spoilers, I listened to these 3 chapters twice, and the first time I listened was like a week ago because I just needed to know. And I complained about this with Brandon Sanderson's writing like the day before or 2 days before I got to this chapter. And when I read this, I was like, thank you. See, this is what I want. I thought I knew how it was going to go. I thought for sure that we were going to watch this emperor go nuts, start attacking people, or doing something that was like obviously leading towards attempts at world domination, anything like this. And instead, what we get is Shera stabbing a smiling, relieved, joking, sane emperor in the back, literally. Wow. I did not see that coming. And this is what I love. We knew that she killed him. It's been talked about a million times. And we know what the Aptasia is supposed to do to him. So it was all set up, and we just... this is what I live for. These kinds of like little twists of like, not only Did you not get what you were expecting to get? But you didn't even realize that you had such a clear expectation until it turns out that isn't what happened. And that for me is the most satisfying, because it's not only the writer turning something on its head in terms of storytelling, it's the writer kind of like pointing out to me my laziness in thinking at times. And so I'm just going to talk about this a little bit out of the gate here. What I love about this, there's so much to love about the way this is set up. I love it so much in so many ways, you guys. I really do. This was like, I didn't even know I wanted it. One, it really underlines how much more cold-blooded Shera is. Everybody else clearly was thinking along the same lines as I was. We're going to wait until it really looks like something is wrong. And Shera is like, yeah, does that sound like a good idea? We're going to wait until this being who is so much stronger than any other in the world that he can take on elders. We're going to wait until he's like displaying actual symptoms of insanity. Really? Does that... No, we're not doing that. But nobody else had the heart to do it. Because one, they all like the Emperor. Like, let's be honest, that's a big factor. Is the guy is likable. Like, he's brutal and looking at what happened with Calder, it was fucked up, you know? But at the same time, you kind of understand the position that he's taking. And also, everybody had... I think that there's a sort of inertia with... Is inertia the way I want? I guess I'll just say, like, people got comfortable having him be the barrier between them and the elders. And the idea of taking that barrier away is very frightening. You know, it's like he is, again, literally the one person on the planet that seems able to withstand and stand up to elders and put them down for any length of time. And I don't blame anybody for being kind of like, well, we're going to want to hold on to this weapon for like as long as is possible. I'm not mad at that. You know, I mean, that just makes sense. So the fact that like the consultants wanted him taken out earlier, notwithstanding, because they had like other things to gain, the people closest to him, I mean, I completely get it. And Geraldus Teach is not pleased, guys. As she mentions, it's only been 4 hours since they had the conversation where Shera tried to, like, basically, she didn't promise. She said, I'll do my best, but I can't guarantee. She did say she couldn't guarantee. So, and I think this is the reason the Emperor told Shera that he wanted her to do it, because he knew that the others didn't have that streak of iciness in them that is needed to just look at something in an incredibly logical... And it's funny because the whole idea of like somebody who is logical to the point that they lose compassion, that is a trope that is used in a lot of things, you know, and one of the most like famous examples recently is the BBC Sherlock, where he's wildly intelligent, but he does not know how to interact with people, and he's a douchebag to everybody. And it's really interesting because Shera isn't like that. It's like her coldness doesn't come from a hyper intelligence in that way. Her coldness comes from a deep practicality that isn't really wrapped in like genius of any kind, other than the genius that she has at like fighting and stalking and killing, which is a very specific thing. So for her to be this logical about whether he should be taken out right now was kind of unexpected, because I don't really think of her as that sort of character. And yet, again, she was the one person who was able to like look at the situation and be like, hey guys, I don't think that we should really like wait around and hope that we get a couple of more years of this, because he was really on the edge there, and we just saw how certain he wasn't going to make it out the other end. And just because he seems to have, that's not exactly all that matters. So there's just a lot. And of course, never mind my assumption. It was going to be, because this is the thing that happens with the judgment calls on who gets to live or die, right? When you have any sort of situation where you have to determine whether somebody, and I'm talking about this in context of fiction, but this is absolutely just as true in real life, that we act like killing is wrong, but then we have our definite like, yeah, but that was fine. We have our lines that we're like fine with crossing for certain specific reasons. And it's fully hypocritical, and a lot of us aren't really willing to look at that. But we all have this sort of, and by all I mean those who are not like Shara, we have this sort of understanding that you don't do it unless it's absolutely necessary. That life is meaningful and sacred in some way, and that unless somebody is going to do something that harms other people in an active and irreparable way, death is not going to be the first thing that you try and answer that with. But Shara is just not like that, you know? And there's a quote later that I'll get to. So I fell into an understanding of how to handle this situation, and this assumption that once I saw the murder of the Emperor, I would agree with Shara. I fully thought when I saw her do it, it would be a relief, that I would also feel the threat, that it would feel inevitable, and the only possible answer. And it's really, really uncomfortable to find out that isn't actually what happened. Because now I have to sort of stop and go, wow, okay, well, obviously he was kind of a ticking time bomb. And a part of me understands where Shara is coming from and feels like she might be right. But it feels wrong. And it's just really interesting to think, like, she just did it maybe a couple weeks, maybe a few months earlier than otherwise would have happened. And probably this was going to be the weakest that he could ever, this was the most opportune moment for her to strike, because he wasn't able to defend himself the way he normally would because he was so drained from using the Ectasia. So her choosing this moment in a lot of ways does make total sense, but it's simply uncomfortable to know that this is how it went down. And it's fascinating to watch the reactions of Lucan and Maya, because they both are trying really hard to acknowledge her interpretation of what was going on, because I think a part of them feels it was the right call also. But they just obviously, it's not quite sitting right with them either. And the only thing that Maya can say is mission accomplished. And I think that's really telling, because that's just as logical as she can be about it. Maya's always about following orders and doing what her superiors tell her to do. And if she can at least hide behind that, that's something. But we know that Lucan doesn't have that sort of feel. And it's interesting to me that he is as cautious and guarded about talking to Shara about it as he is. So I just love this so much, you guys. I really, really do. So let's go and start at the beginning of chapter 18. She is in the midst of this reading because when the Emperor got into the Optasia, it fucking pulls all of them into this vision with him. I also was not expecting that. I don't know if anybody listening to this thought that's how it was going to be. Fully didn't. And I don't know if maybe that was me being foolish or if it just... But I thought we were going to sort of watch from the outside and maybe we would hear the Emperor talking as if there was somebody in the room, which would give us sort of an idea of what he was seeing. But I just sort of... There was so much unexpected about all of this. So they get pulled in, and it's sort of like they're in a void, and they can't, like, see themselves, or, like... And he didn't warn them that this was happening. So that, for me, was also a bit of a thing. Was like, does he know that this is how it will be for them and not warn them? Or was he unaware? Because I don't know how many times there have been people in the room this close to him while he's been using this thing. So I'm not going to get like too much into each individual section here, but I will say that she's looking around and kind of panicking, and she remembers a quote from Maxwell: "The loser panics, the victor makes decisions." And it says, she took a deep breath even though she couldn't feel her lungs, and let it go. There was nothing she could do about this, so she might as well enjoy the ride. If it grew dangerous, Lucan would have to break them free. Which is really like putting a lot of faith in him, but what else is she going to do, genuinely, at that moment? And this is the kind of thing that I am a control freak, and I have said this many times. I am somebody who likes to, like, know what's going on, feel like I have all the information that I can work with in order to plan ahead. I like to feel like everything that is under my power to do something about, I have. But I can then be really, really good at deciding to relinquish it once I have explored all of my options. And this is the kind of thing that, like, it doesn't often happen because there's always a sort of sense of like, well, I could be doing something. But sometimes there's not. Like, you're in a waiting room somewhere, you know, and it's just going to take as long as it's going to fucking take. Or you're stuck in traffic and it's not because, you know, of anything that you can do anything about. And it's interesting because I have this tendency to want to control things, but then I'll be sitting with my mom in the car in a traffic jam, or with Owen, and they are losing their minds. And it doesn't even occur to me to get mad at the situation unless we're late somewhere, and that's frustrating. But it's like getting angry at the weather, you know, there's no point. And it's always surprising to me how I can be so impatient about some things, and then other things, I am like as placid as a glacier and just like, well, I guess this is what we're doing, and I guess we'll just have to sit here until we're not doing it anymore. So this moment I really related to, actually. So her vision keeps getting like yanked and pulled in different directions in a way that kind of reminded me of what it might be like to be using like a VR headset. She's not choosing to look in certain directions. In fact, there are several moments in which she distinctly would prefer to not be looking at what she is looking at. But she doesn't have a choice. The way that this is happening, she's not in control of it. It feels like she's looking through the Emperor's eyes. And there's this explosion. A man crouched in the crater his landing had created, his back covered in a giant turtle shell. A loose-fitting helmet surrounded his face, and when he turned his head to look deeper into the jungle, she saw he was actually wearing an inhuman skull. From the trees that he'd scattered, an elder spawn crawled out. It had to be an elder spawn. Not only was it more hideous than any chimera, it came with a skin-crawling feeling, a distant sense of wrongness. Shara supposed this was how her mind interpreted a reader's detection of intent. And we get this description. It's horrifying. I'm not going to get into it, but I'm just going to say it has hundreds of like frog legs, and I can't even imagine what looks like it's got hundreds of legs, but that they're like a centipede, but it's frog legs. No, thank you. I don't think so. No. And then she hears the name Othagor in her head and realizes that this is the Emperor explaining that's who did this, because that guy fucks with things that are alive. Nkothi puts together dead shit. This thing does live shit. The frog elder spawn whipped its tongue forward, and it looked like nothing that belonged on or in an animal. It was almost like a frond of a predatory jungle plant surrounded by folds of purple and violet. In their center, the petals concealed a single needle at the tip that dripped with poison. The turtle-shelled man raised his forearm to block, and Shera saw that he had smaller turtle shells strapped to his arms, which is very smart. And this is when she starts like getting sort of drawn to look at the elder spawn more than she wants to, and she starts to get a headache. And later on we find out that like Lucan is really suffering, because as an actual reader, his sensitivity is going to be much worse than hers. So if she's suffering, it's so much worse for him. The world warped around the elder. A transparent globe of force formed around its body, sucking it into the center of the bubble. It struggled as it was pulled through the air, but the Emperor's power had an irresistible gravity. The creature twisted and folded as it was caught, as though the force of the Emperor's will was crumpling it into a ball like a discarded piece of paper. And basically, what the Emperor is doing here is jumping from place to place, grabbing the elder spawn that have spawned there, squashing them in his hand, and moving on to the next place. So they keep seeing all of these different cultures and peoples that are in the midst of an attack getting saved by what seemed to just be a giant disembodied hand. And she's sort of wondering, like, how unusual is this for them? Like, do they see this a lot? I don't know how involved the Emperor is. Or is this like a wild thing that they're going to tell stories about and people won't believe them? Like, what is, you know? And one of the women is speaking another language, and Shera thinks that was probably the strangest part of the whole vision. There were no other languages. One of the Emperor's first accomplishments in establishing the Aurelian Empire was the standardization of language. Everyone spoke Imperial. And I'm just like, well, I mean, that's all well and good for people who live not in completely rural areas where they hold on to what they fucking hold on to. But, you know, this is obviously a very different type of... They're wearing turtle shells for armor. They don't have, like, the kind of manufacturing capabilities, it doesn't seem like. So he goes from place to place, and they even at one point are underwater. This inspired a different sort of pure biological panic. Her breath seized up. She knew logically that she wasn't really there, that this was the same as being in a dream, but she still had to take in a little shallow breath first to prove to herself she wouldn't suck in a mouthful of water. A statue rested nearby on the seabed, covered in mud, algae, and barnacles, but this one wasn't buried. She could see the pedestal at its base and make out the details. It was one of the simpler statues of the Emperor she'd ever seen, merely depicting him standing with his arms clasped before him, multi-layered robes waving. She'd only seen the head last time, but this statue seemed identical. In the distant, blue-tinged darkness, something moved. Now, see, this was interesting, that she'd only seen the head last time, but this statue seemed identical. Are they time traveling? Because she wonders that at one point, and then she's like, I don't think so. But the way this is described, it seems like she is. You know? So I'm not really sure what to think about this. So this thing comes at them, undulating. It was a shark big enough to swallow a clock tower. Its skin was nothing more than a layer of grit and rough stone, as though it had been chiseled out from deep within the earth, and she could have built a house on the broad sweep of its fins. And honestly, guys, I don't know about y'all, but I have a real, like, there are certain things that get under my skin in terms of imagining. One of them is, for me, heights. Like, I am really scared of heights. Descriptions about heights in books can get to me. Watching people deal with heights in video games fuck with me. The being basically exposed and vulnerable in water as a creature many, many times your size swims around you, that's a pretty close second. There is my husband was playing Shadow of the Colossus for a little while there. And that was a game that you kill these giant creatures, and most of them are on land, but not all of them. And let me tell you, I hated being in the room when he was fighting the underwater ones, because there is something about knowing you are not on home turf. This is not your territory. You are not meant to be in water. That thing is meant to be in water. You are already at such a disadvantage. Could not do it. I hated it so much. Even playing like Skyrim, when you wade or swim across rivers or lakes, there will sometimes be creatures underwater that will chase you, and it's not always there. But whenever they did start to chase me, I would absolutely lose my mind. That is one of the hardest I've ever seen Owen laugh, was the sheer panic I reacted with at being followed by this thing. He was not ready for me. I was screeching. I'm not even exaggerating. So imagining this thing, I just hate it so much. Will keeps poking at these like specific fears in a way that feels really unfair. And I'm sure he's doing it because this is just like sort of a universal thing, you know? But nevertheless, it feels kind of personal. So let's see. He says Kellerak. This would be a servant, an elder in its own right, and it was likely older than the Empire and more intelligent than Shara could grasp. The thought was particularly disturbing as she stared into its vast, predatory mouth. So, the whole thing here is, what is the word I'm looking for here? I'm sorry, guys. I'm so distracted because I'm like also trying to scan the page for the spot that I want. But its black eyes, each of which were the size of her torso, were set in 2 rows of 3. A vast 6-eyed fish. Again, no, dislike. The shark creature shifted its course, moving aside a current's worth of water as it angled itself for the surface. At the distance of Shara's perception, she saw a shadow sitting on the surface above. And then her vision completely moves again. And there is a ship up there. This elder servant of Kellerak was going to swallow them whole. Which I'm afraid being in the water with it. And it turns out you don't even need to be in the water with it. And that's just really rude. It literally swallowed them whole. Can you imagine? I mean, you just don't know what hit you. It's just darkness, and I guess you drown eventually in its stomach. I don't even know. And the Emperor stops it and begins to sort of drag it using this bubble, and it's thrashing. Shara couldn't help but wonder what the sailors on the navigator's ship thought, seeing an impossibly huge shark pulled out of the water under their boat and pulled away by an invisible hand. The scene changed again. Hazy dark of a moonlit night and the silhouette of a broken city. Towers reached for the heavens, but some had been snapped in half. The sudden shift to darkness startled her until she realized it made sense. They were seeing events all over the world. The people were running from the city, scrambling up a grassy hill like sheep fleeing wolves. There were 5 of them, dressed as though they had come from a party. The women wore long, elaborate dresses, and the men wore suits decorated with flowers. They came from an Erinan social, And she is surprised at herself for even knowing that. And it turns out that they are being chased by these weird shadows that look like they're being cast by something flying in the air, but there isn't anything there. And this is the one that he says, Ergnaut. And Lucan shouted something she couldn't catch, and even Shera strained against the restrictions of the vision, trying to return her non-existent body to safety. It did nothing, of course. All of the great elders were terrifying and incomprehensible. But you could wrap your mind around most of them. Kvanakar had his worms, Othagor his bizarre amphibian creatures, Nakothi dead monstrosities. They were no less frightening, but they could be fought. A man with an invested sword, given strength and luck, could stand against one of the children of Nakothi. But Ergnaut, the creeping shadow, was another story. One of the elder spawn shadow overtook its two partners, catching up to the son and his ailing father. The son screamed something, but the father stopped in place. The shadow circled them once, like a killer isolating her target. I love that it says her target. That feels very purposeful. The younger man ran, abandoning his dignity, half crawling up the hill in his haste to get away. The women had already outpaced them, their shoes abandoned and dresses torn. The old man stayed behind, panting, as a shadow cornered him. The night was silent except for the wind through the grass. Then, utterly without sound or warning, the shadow slipped over the man. Darkness covered him, as though a black curtain had fallen on his head. It was deceptively peaceful. When the shadow moved on a moment later, there was no trace the old man had ever been. Ergnaut and his spawn didn't attack you. They didn't even kill you. When you were taken by one of the creeping shadows, you ceased to exist. And I am not positive, but I think this is the creature, or it was like one of his spawn that took Darius's face. It seems like it would be related with the shadow, but I'm not positive about that. And honestly, the idea of being chased by a shadow that is being cast by nothing, that is extremely unnerving. And yeah, this whole, like, all of these situations are just so nightmarish. And this woman has a bag full of stuff, and she's like pulling a bunch of things out of her bag as if she's looking for something. And then there's a mirror. As soon as the mirror landed on the grass, the reading focused on it. And he sticks it to this lady's dress. So as she turns and runs, and she's carrying something in her hand, the mirror is still stuck to her dress and, like, following her. Shera watched, and as she did, the reflected starlight grew gradually brighter and brighter. Behind the girl in the red dress, the grass lit up as though by a newborn moon. The shadows hesitated. The mirror flared to life, spewing blue-white light like a shattered quick lamp. Darkness vanished, and the shadows began to fizzle as the light ate into them. Shera thought she heard a scream, piercing and inhuman, drilling its way into her mind. The appearance of the light frightened the girl more than anything so far, and she ran even faster, the mirror bobbing on the back of her dress. And they're still running, screaming, but they're not being chased by anything anymore. They're just unaware that whatever was chasing them is gone now. And there is something about the fact that they're continuing to run that I felt really bad about. And Shera is even thinking about how, like, it's really hard watching people with this kind of panic and not being able to help them. And she wants to be able to fight. It's not even like, you know, I'm saying not be able to help them. But honestly, that's not the way it goes in her head. I'm kind of putting my own, like, what my attitude would be here onto Shera. And instead, really, it's just about, I want to fight it. I can't believe that I'm forced to watch and I can't even fight it. Over the next few hours, the reading flicked from scene to scene all over the world. Some took an instant to resolve. An inquisitor of Akhmagut robbing cupboards to discover what people in the Dilian Basin ate for breakfast, while the Emperor spent long minutes and focused intent on others, slaying monsters and warning nearby guild members. Once, he coaxed some bees into stinging a group of Luminian pilgrims out of bed. They were already alert and in the streets when the first Elder Spawn attacked, which I loved so much. And as this is all happening, Shera's headache is getting worse and worse and worse. And then we go back to night, and they are looking at Silverreach. And the whole place is dead. The vision didn't linger on the streets. It plunged down, diving through the cobblestones as if through water. A room opened beneath her. A nightmare waited between towering bookshelves. But what caught Shera's attention was the abomination at the center. It was a twisting mass of limbs, tentacles, and vile protrusions that defied observation and description. If she stared into the core, she was sure she would be sick, so she focused on the ends of the tendrils instead. And it's Akhmagut greeting the Emperor as former slave, which, as she mentions, means a lot of things. And just the presence of this actual Great Elder is really fucking with everybody, as we find out. But of course, we're only in Shera's POV, and she feels like it's looking right at her. She wished her emotions would freeze away and leave her empty, as they so often did in combat, but it felt as though the Elder's grip kept even her thoughts held tight. And she watches this like back and forth where the Emperor is basically like, you pushed me too fucking far. And there's a sort of sense there, like, we had an agreement that I would leave you mostly alone. And I don't think that's really what's meant, but there was something about that of just like, it didn't have to be like this, but you really had to push it, didn't you? When he said the Elder's game spanned the whole world, he was almost being literal. Everything she'd seen tonight, every Elder-related problem that the Emperor had corrected, were parts of a plan that stretched back centuries and would continue for centuries more, each little detail in its place. So I must be stronger than you predicted, the Emperor said. And her vision focuses again on Silverreach. And she's looking at all of the details of it. Her head felt like it would split open. Maya screamed in pure animal pain. Then Silverreach exploded. The town was covered by a transparent bubble of forceful intent as the Emperor had used before. This time, instead of hauling a shark out of the water, it pounded 500 homes to dust in a single instant. Each tile shattered, every beam in every house torn to splinters, every rock smashed. The town burst, and the sound drowned out the world. So it all collapses downward. And as it, collapses, Akhmagut says goodbye. And that's how it ends, is Akhmagut saying goodbye. In a way that makes me go, Akhmagut, are you, banking on the Emperor getting killed? What does that mean? You're not saying goodbye because you're dying, because we know you don't die exactly. What was that? But anyway, so, yeah, very dramatic scene. Then we jump to present day. And it's Shera and Yala, and they have this conversation where Yala basically is like, yeah, I sent Lucan on his mission by himself. One life is pretty cheap. And I was like, look, I get that in theory, but Lucan seems like he was really useful, and it seems like a waste. And I don't know if that's just me overestimating his value because of being close to him as a character, but it just seems kind of like not a great choice. I don't know. And I love Shera just saying, I'll have to kill you then. She didn't know how ordinary people dealt with grief, but she knew what was fair. Yala was responsible for Lucan's death, so Shera would kill her. The scales would be balanced. Simple mathematics. And Yala is just like, he was doing his fucking job. If you want to threaten me, I can have you executed for that. But we're about to fight a fucking battle over some shit you started, by the way. They are coming to this island. So can we at least set aside this bullshit until after it's all done? And Shara is like, yeah, okay, we can do that. And again, just so practical. So she gets handed over to Darius, who, again, I just think is delightful. And he tells her, we're going to give you Siphon back and them take you straight to the battle. And she's like, really? You're not worried about giving it back to me? Like, you know what it does and what happened, right? With the Magister's Guild. And he asks, do you know what my job is? And she's like, kind of like mine, but you're less quiet about it. And he explains about the little girls and how they had been scheduled for death, basically. And he says, I have never once regretted leaving a casket empty. Shara's immediate response was a sort of cynical doubt. Never? She could think of a few of her own targets who might have been rehabilitated given time, but for the most part, the world was better off without them. Even now, she regretted leaving Calder Martin alive. Almost against her will, she wondered what Lucan would have thought. And this is one of those things that I really enjoy. There's no guilt. Nothing about Shara. It's not like that. It's truly that she can't believe anybody out there doesn't wish that they'd taken a certain person out when they had the chance. And I just love how that doesn't compute for her. It feels like, I'm sorry, I admire the sentiment, but that's just not possible. Like, be realistic. Be honest. You're full of shit. And I don't think he is, but I completely understand why she feels like he must be, you know? And it says he'd kill his fair share of people, she's talking about Lucan again, for the Emperor and for the Guild, never more than he had to. He went to absurd lengths sometimes to make sure those he encountered walked away alive. Would he call that a mistake? No, he never would have. Regardless of how it turned out, he would say he'd made the right decision at the time. In the same situation with the same information, he'd have done it all the same way. Maybe the chance to save a life was worth it. Maybe it was a reader thing. And she tells him, thanks for sparing my life. If it were me, I would not have spared your life. And he's like, well, it's pretty good that we aren't in that situation then. And then, if you feel repelled to repay me, I don't, then think twice before you next kill someone. You might be glad you did. And she says, I'll get that chance very soon. Does not say, I'll think about it. There's no suggestion of like, I am going to consider what you said. She's just stating a fact. I'm going to have that chance very soon because I am going to be in the position to kill people very shortly. I love her so much. She just doesn't like... She does not fuck around. She's so literal. So she gets Siphon back, and Joran has it, and it's just like, dude, what the fuck is with this weapon? This shit is out of control. And she's like, I've been feeding it well. And he's like, yeah, maybe put it on a bit of a diet. And she's like, that's not happening. And I just love that he is actually, like, he's a regent, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. And he's intimidated by this weapon. That feels very significant. You're a tad out of orbit there, Shara. Is your house all in order upstairs? Icy wind blew through Shara's chest, and she was in no mood to interpret Joran's rambling. She held out her hand for Siphon without a word. Darius spoke up for the first time. Be easy on her for a while. She's had quite a rough time of it these past few weeks, and I'm given to understand she lost someone important. And Shara is not like pleased that he's stepping in. She's just like, one, how did you know about Lucan? And two, who fucking gave you permission to speak for me? She doesn't appreciate it at all. But they get interrupted by Joran noticing the shadow around Darius's head and like starting to poke and prod at him. And Darius is like, ew, I don't want that. And Joran is completely ignoring him. Young man, would you consent to a few examinations? It might be within my power to break this curse. When the current conflict is over, you can poke and prod as much as you like, Darius said casually. He didn't sound nearly as excited as Shara had imagined he should, faced with the idea he might be able to find a cure. Maybe he'd been offered a cure too often. And I think that's exactly it. I'm sure he's run into plenty of people who were like, I think I could do something for you, and it turns out they absolutely cannot. But I really felt for him in that moment, because there is nothing like having your hopes raised and dashed over and over again to just get you going, later. We'll deal with it later. So, let's see. Your intent, it's almost like there are two people all tangled up inside you. This is, he is a regent. Okay. He's talking to Shara here. A cold metal puppet and a lazy girl with a quick wit. Cyphron tugged you one way or another, but now all I sense is the puppet. It's a shame. I liked the girl better. And she doesn't really react to that. She just, takes her weapon, but there's no feeling of, resentment at the comment or wishing that the girl was back as well. There's nothing, and I was sort of I guess not surprised that she has no reaction, but she can be introspective sometimes, and I expected a little something and didn't get it here. Let's see. Carrion wasn't particularly difficult to find. She stood at the top of the stairs. I'm sure you have higher priorities than carrying paintings. Shara didn't feel like joking in response. Last time Calder Martin tore through us with the Emperor's crown. What are your countermeasures? And Carrion gave her an odd look, and I think she is aware Shara is not dealing well. She's trying to she's trying to joke around with her. It's being rejected, and she could reach out and be like, are you okay? But she knows that's not going to work. Shara's not going to receive that well. So it's just a moment of trying to decide how to handle it, and then I guess I'll just answer your question and leave it at that. And this is when Carrion is saying, because she says we believe the orders of the High Council should override those of the Crown. Why? And she says, do you remember the last line of your oath? And Shara repeats back, I bind my will and my loyalty to the mists, never to be revoked. Did you never find it interesting that we don't have our members swear to the Empire or even to the Guild? Juggle your knives for me. And Shara thinks for a minute about how stupid that request is before noticing that she is doing it. Already, she is juggling them. And, Carrion delicately placed the box back in her bag. That's with the veil at low power and with a thin mist. For a few seconds, you could do nothing but follow my orders so long as they didn't violate your loyalty to the Guild or lead you to harm yourself. There are limits, but with this we should be protected from both the Crown and Guild Head Bliss's elder powers, which I was like, oh shit, we're going to see Bliss. I'm excited because Bliss is such a weirdo. So there was always the danger that he would catch her with a surprise order from the Crown while she was out of the protection of the veil, causing her to hesitate. Carrion saw her face. Shara, what are the odds that you'll be able to reach a primary threat and eliminate it in the first hour of battle? And Shara is basically like, that's absolutely not a problem. I will get it right away. I will have a much better chance if the fight drags on until sunset. I'm not certain we can hold on so long. By sunset, we intend to have driven them off the island or else retreated to a stronghold. We've prepared Bastion's shadow, and there should be just enough room aboard for all guild members currently present. It will be crowded, but we'll make it. And Shera says, yeah, I think I can improve our odds somewhat. So then we jump into the conversation between her and Benji, because Shera has to go and visit him, and there are those guards outside, and one of them is Hansen, who she knocked out last time, and his partners do not appreciate that he just basically gives everything up to Shera, no question, but he is not willing to, like, argue with them about it. He's just like, no, we're letting her in, and that's what we're doing. So she goes in and talks to Benji, admits that she doesn't recognize him, and he doesn't even seem like that mad about it. He's just like, well, we really fucking remember you. You could slit a man's throat, wipe the knife off on your pants, and use that same knife to cut your meat. Even Maxwell wasn't that cold. He sounded admiring, not accusatory, though Shera remembered that somewhat differently. In fact, all she remembered was the taste of the meat. An insane revolutionary Maxwell may have been, but he grilled a nice pork chop. And I love that. When he says that, it sounds like it's a metaphor. It sounds like she's so crazy she would, and just says something that sounds crazy. And it's a fucking thing that happened. It genuinely happened. And she's like, I cut a guy's throat? I don't remember that. The fucking pork chop was banging. I guess I must have killed a guy, though. And that is just her in a fucking nutshell, isn't it? So she asks, why were you working for the Magisters Guild? And he basically is like, well, we just wanted to be doing something important. The Empire was weak, and the Luminians let us go, and we just decided to go with the first place that hired us. Who taught you to act like consultants? For the first time, he frowned in confusion. No one. Maxwell taught us, same as you, and we tried to keep his lessons alive. The Magisters had a few tutors in for us, hired killers from around the Empire, but nobody mentioned the Consultants Guild. They just encouraged us to keep our skills sharp. He seemed genuine, but there were too many similarities to ignore. Maybe he and the older children had gotten specific consultant training from Maxwell somehow, though that seemed impossible. Or perhaps one of the tutors was a rogue gardener. And this is when he says, we killed a regent. Who can say they've done more? And she says, the one who killed the emperor. And for a moment, he is like, wait, what? And then he realizes, and he can't even like finish the sentence. And he sits back, and clearly this has sort of changed the way they see her, which it should. I have a target, a reader and a navigator captain who managed to get his hands on the Emperor's crown. He can control any loyal citizens to the Empire. Are there any loyal citizens here? A few shouts, some scattered laughter. Will you help me kill my target and maybe a guild head or two? It will mean working against the Magisters. And Benji says, one more question, how much are you paying? When she walked back up the stairs, she was trailed by 30 killers in red prison suits. She'd have to find them some spare blacks. Now, I'm going to say, regarding their training, I think Yala has something to do with it. I don't know what, but I feel like Yala is mixed in with this somehow, because she's shady, and I just feel like she's going to be playing her own game. I don't like it. So they have arrived early on the island, and Cyphrin is like, let me do it. Let me kill him. Come on, let's go. And Shera says, okay, let's go. And Cyphrin practically screamed in joy. And then we get to chapter 20. And there was a hole where the town of Silverreach had once stood, and now it was on fire. The Emperor is watching in satisfaction. The reading ends. Everybody comes out of it, and nobody was prepared. Lucan is literally on the floor, like on his knees. Maya is freaking out and in sort of battle mode. Shera feels like she may vomit. And the Emperor is grinning from ear to ear and laughing and feeling so satisfied. And for a moment, they think that the laughter is a signal that he has lost it. "I did it," he said at last, and his voice was rough, almost hoarse. "I did it again. He won't be able to recover from that for..." The Emperor seemed to run out of breath, and he simply chuckled instead. "What about the rest of it? It was all Akhmagut's plan. Has been for years. He knew I would use the Optasia again, knew I would even beat him, but he was betting on me losing myself, and I'm still here. Help me out of this." Maya says, "Are you saying the Great Elder made a mistake?" The Elder leaned back. "Suspicious. Good. That's why I wanted you. But you're not taking into account the difference on scale. Men call me immortal, but Akhmagut is truly timeless. For me, tonight was a major victory, but it set all the Elders back years. It probably set him back centuries. For him, it was nothing more than a minor fluctuation, and one he probably accounted for. It doesn't matter to him if it takes another 10,000 years to beat me and return to life, so long as he eventually does. But that doesn't mean we don't have something to celebrate." And Shera relaxes. They let him out. He is jovial in a way that they have never seen. And yet she can't shake this thought. The Elders had cornered him into betting his sanity on an uncertain outcome, and he'd escaped this time. This time. But as he'd said, Akhmagut could afford to play this game for 10,000 years. Eventually the Emperor would lose. Maybe tomorrow, maybe in 100 years, his attempts to hold the Empire together would finally break it. Given enough time, the Elders would win, so long as the Emperor ruled. As she watched Maya carry the Emperor away, Lucan still smiling and helping as best he could, Shera felt like she'd swallowed a dagger. And this is interesting to me. The Elders would win so long as the Emperor ruled. Why is it so long as the Emperor ruled? Why is there no suggestion that the Elders could win if the Emperor isn't here? I'm assuming that it's because the Elders would wield the Emperor as their weapon, but it feels like they don't really even need to do that, do they? I'm just kind of confused about the options available here. So she pulls out her weapon, freezes up her feelings, and gets up behind him and goes in under the ribs and stabs him. And he is so weak that it actually works. She looked up at Lucan and Maya, who were still paralyzed. Maya's eyes were wide with shock, and they were bright orange with vertically slitted pupils. Her alchemical enhancements were calling out for blood. Lucan had pulled both his gloves off, but he hadn't touched his own shears. So he'd started to react, and then frozen, unsure. He'd hesitated. His expression, if she had to put a name to it, she'd say he looked desolate but resolved, as though he'd watched a brother die but had already come to terms with reality. He nodded to her once. "I understand," he said. He started to say something else. Only half a minute after death, the Emperor proved he would not go as quietly as anyone else. The Emperor's intent exploded out of him in a fury of invisible force. It was like the hazy bubbles he'd produced in the Optasia, a semi-gold dome that expanded outward in a wave, tearing his surroundings apart. Shera was blasted backward, tumbling away from the corpse, though she managed to hang on to both her shears and the heart of Nakothi. The room was practically destroyed. They'd gotten off lucky, which I thought was pretty funny. Like, that does sound like, it really does sound like it could have been worse. So she has the heart, and she says, "We need to get this to the Grey Island. We can destroy it there." Even her voice was distant and professional. They were on assignment now, and they only had to finish it. Something twisted in her hand, as though she gripped a live mouse in her fist. And it says she glanced down at the heart in its pewter shell. I don't remember the description of the shell, but is that made for it to be hung around his neck, or do the hearts have shells? Because I'm assuming they don't look like regular human hearts, but I don't really remember. We haven't gotten like a specific description since the first book. And this is when Lucan yells for them to run because it starts whispering. Teach had warned her, "You'll have to separate the heart from him immediately, or the dead mother's power will bring the Emperor back to life." And Maya grabs her and pulls her, and Gerilys Teach comes in, and this is when she said, "It didn't even take you 4 hours." Teach slammed a fist into her back, lightning quick. Shara went down. But after she hit the ground, somehow her breathing got easier. She took in a few breaths and her mind cleared. Whatever Teach had done to her was lifted. Lucan had one hand pressed to her back and one raised to Teach. "It was necessary," he said. Teach didn't look like she cared. And this is when she pulls Tearfang out. And everybody begins to, collapse. Teach lashed out with her full fury against something at the far end of the room. A red-tinted shadow whipped out of the blade, washing over the room's back half, blasting through the swirling portal that had grown over the Emperor's body. It was a circular window into a deep void, blackness that danced with strange, distant lights of many colors. She would almost call them stars, but they were a little too big, far too colorful, and they spun with palpable energy. Eclipsing them, crawling through the gateway, was a child of the dead mother. And this just... Guys, I hate these things. I really do. So Gerilys Teach yells for them to leave, and this is when Shara says, "I had to," and Maya just says, "Mission accomplished." And they are back on the island with their Heart of Nikothi in the box, which is a familiar place for us from the last book. If I hadn't acted tonight while he was weak, he could have killed us all. And this is when Lucan says, "Why did Yala want you to kill him so soon?" And she says because of him getting out of control, but Lucan's like, well, then she might come to me, somebody who would know when he was starting to lose it. Why wouldn't she? And she's like, yeah, because I wouldn't hesitate. If the High Counselors knew about this powerful weapon that could magnify the Emperor's reading to a global scale, they had good reason to act early, but they should also talk to the squad's reader preparing him. Why hadn't they? Here's another question, Lucan said, still tight with contained anger. If they knew about this device, why didn't they tell us? And at first she's like, maybe they didn't know, and then she stops and is like, of course they fucking knew. So he pulls off a glove, and he says, walls don't hold much intent. They're not actually used for anything, so they only get invested when they're built or something very significant happens. But there's a lot that can happen in 1,500 years, and it's a big island. I might be able to dig something up. And she just tells him to be careful. And I'm wondering if this is whatever it is that he does that causes him to get locked up. Because we never really got a straight story about why he was in prison. But he was imprisoned already at the start of the last book, if I'm not mistaken. And we never really found out any more about that. So I feel like he must have uncovered something. And when she says be careful, she puts a hand on his shoulder, and he looks kind of amused, and I think it's because he can tell she has to stop and be like, what would a normal person do right now? And I think he senses that she's just acting like a person as best she can, and that this is not necessarily insincere, but it's certainly not natural, you know? And the chapter ends with Yala saying, Lucan, we need you to come with us because we don't have anything that can destroy the heart. And then Lucan points at the shear and says, you have a blade that killed the emperor, so you should do it. And that is the end of the chapter. So, yeah, very interested in what Lucan winds up uncovering, and really interested in the battle with Calder, because I don't know what they're after at this point. You know, like, there was a murder, and it was his wife that did it. How is he going to handle that? I'm just very curious. So, all right, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you again very much to George for commissioning this episode. So much fun, these books. And thank you, everybody, for listening. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.